we've been discussing the rising fascism and state terrorism against rural communities in the Philippines, the counterinsurgency programs of Philippine President Marcos that seek to silence the Filipino people's cries for change rather than working towards peace. And during this panel, we will address the increasing U.S. military buildup in the Philippines and their involvement in these counterinsurgency operations, really focusing on how this impacts the Filipino people's struggle for rights, land, and peace. Again, if you have questions, please make a note and reserve them for the plenary discussion which will come next after this panel. So we will hear first from Drew Miller. Drew is the General Secretary of the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines. He is a birthright Quaker and a United Methodist from the United States and currently based in Canada. So let us welcome Drew.
Hello, there we go. Okay, so just to start with a question to the audience, because they said to save your questions, but I can ask you questions. So, if you are not from the United States, people outside of the United States, raise your hand if you know your country has some sort of military agreement or joint exercises or involvement with the Philippine governments on a military level. Wow, quite a few, look at that. You can lower your hands now. Okay, now we may already know the answer to this, but if you're from the United States and you have many military agreements with the Philippines, raise your hand. All right, so my point of asking that question to you is to point that there are many countries who are allies of the United States now forming new military agreements and even sending their troops to the Philippines. And there is a growing trend of that following US policy to militarize the Philippines and use it as a military base, the whole country. So that is something that ICHRP has used the term a soft invasion. We actually use this term during the elections in the Philippines because there was a statement from a Philippine government official from the National Security Agency, the assistant director, his last name is Malaya, had a comment about it. And this came after the Balikatan exercises. So also, one more question to you. Raise your hand if you already know what the Balikatan exercises are. Okay, so about half the room. So the Balikatan exercises are a joint military exercise between the United States and the Philippines. This exercise has been growing year by year, and actually for the past couple years, they keep saying, this is the biggest Balikatan exercise ever. And it's true. This year there were 16,000 troops jointly between the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the US, and now several other countries. So there is actually 19 countries that participated in some way, either sending troops or observing the Balikatan exercises that were a part of it. So there's a growing military soft invasion happening in the Philippines. So in the context of these Balikatan exercises, there's many groups and people in the Philippines criticizing the exercises for what they are, as the obstruction of Philippine sovereignty. And this is also what ICHRP said. So even ICHRP held protest actions in support of the Filipino people's desire for national sovereignty and for US troops not to be in the country. And so back to this national security director in the Philippines. So in the context of the elections, because the Balikatan exercises happened almost simultaneously with the elections this year in the Philippines, he said, "You will see narratives coming from Beijing that the Pagtatanim exercises are a threat to regional peace and stability. And you will also see that coming from local proxies. So essentially, what he's saying on this point of local proxies is he's saying if there's any candidate in the Philippines who's critical of the US role and military presence there, then they are just representing China. They're just spokespeople being paid by China. And this narrative is one that is not just rooted in the Philippines. It's actually rooted in the US military strategy. So the US tries to make China into what we can call a boogeyman. It tries to say China is so bad, they're encroaching on the Philippines, and so the US needs to protect the Philippines. And that's how they justify their military presence. That's the public narrative that they want to put out there. So when we say that the US is orchestrating a soft invasion, what we mean by that is saying it's masking its real reason for being in the Philippines. While it's saying it's there to defend the country, to defend a free and open Indo-Pacific, as it will claim, it's actually there for the plunder of land and resources in an anti-people imperialist fashion. So contrary to the fact that the National Security Advisor said that Filipinos who oppose Balikatan are proxies of China, it's true actually that the Filipino people have been clamoring for the ouster of US bases in the country for decades. And in fact, in 1991, there was a mass movement of people who were able to push the end of the contracts of the US bases in the country. And yet, despite that, after several years, the US maneuvered to form new contracts with the Philippines, especially the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which formed military sites around the country. And it started out being 5 US bases in the Philippines, which entrenched themselves inside of Philippine military bases. But now it's been moved to 9. And there's also word of secret bases that aren't publicly known, which is why they're secret, right? That are also around the country, because the US is not going to announce all of its presence there, no. So, in addition to the uptick of the US presence in the bases, there's also more military agreements, as I mentioned, happening around the world, and as many of you know who raised your hands know as well. So Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and most recently Germany just created new visiting forces agreement with the Philippines. There's not just the Balikatan exercises, there's many others happening throughout the year. Most recently, it was the Kamandang War Games, which started last October, and they had over 2,000 US and Philippine Marines joined by contingents from Australia, Japan, South Korea, the UK, France, Thailand, and Indonesia. And then again, Kamandang 9 on May 26, which extended operations across the country, including again, forces from Japan, South Korea, and the UK. So we talked about earlier the fact that the basis for this, the US tries to peddle, oh, it's to defend against China, but the reality is it is for economic interests. So surrounding the Philippines are very key commercial straits and choke points for global shipping. So there's the Strait of Malacca and the Strait of Hormuz. And the geographical location of the Philippines with its proximity to China puts it in these key shipping lanes. And it also stands as the 5th most mineral-rich country in the world. And that makes it very vulnerable to US imperialist aggression. However, this has been happening for many years. There was also the Spanish colonization of the Philippines. And since that time, the Filipino people have been fighting back. They have been waging a struggle for national liberation, which is what contributed to the 1991 ouster of the US bases in the first place. And it is because the Filipino people want to have control of their own lands and resources that they fight back. And then some of them even take up arms, and that is why we had before the discussion of the peace talks. There's peace talks because there's a war in the Philippines. But thinking back to the Jubilee year in which we're in right now, we have to recognize that the people's struggle for sovereignty and a struggle to properly care and share the land amongst each other is a struggle that is just. So with that, I also want to go back to the fact that the real reason the US is heavily in the Philippines is not because of its defense against China, but also, in addition to wanting to control the land and resources of the Philippines, to also crush any interests, any opposition and resistance to US interests in the region. So while the US and the Marcos regime right now, who is very good friends with the US, is peddling these reasons, I want to reflect from the book and the prophet of Jeremiah, who has this quote: "They dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, but there is no peace." In thinking about faith, faith requires us to be attentive to the issues of unpeace, to tell the truth and address what is most serious. So, as people outside the Philippines, we must address the seriousness of the wounds caused by US militarism and confront the distortions and colonial machinations of the US and all of its allies in countries where we reside, justifying their presence in the Philippines. There is not peace in the Philippines while US and other foreign troops remain there.
Thank you, Drew. Hello, thank you. Thank you, Drew, for exposing the truth behind US policy and military buildup in the Philippines, right? Specifically, the interests of the US in maintaining access to resources and political power in the Asia Pacific, and its ongoing support for the Philippine government's attacks against its own people to serve its anti-people and imperialist interests. Next, we will welcome back Charm of Karapatan and Defend Southern Tagalog from our earlier panel. So welcome, Charm.
Once again, good afternoon, everyone. So as Drew have mentioned, there has been a soft invasion of the US, of the United States, to the Philippines. And in this panel, I'm talking about the direct impacts that it has on the people of the Philippines and what actually happens on ground. Across the Philippines today, the terrain of our struggle is shifting. From Luzon, Visayas to Mindanao, we see a deepening form of militarism, not just from our own armed forces, but from foreign troops operating on our soil under the flag of partnership. And at the heart of this, we see the growing presence and influence of the United States military, enabled by government policy, legitimized by treaties, and concealed behind the language of peace and development. We must call it by its name. US intervention is real, it is escalating, and it is harming our people. Under the Marcos Jr. administration, the Philippines has intensified its role in US military strategy. Through the Visiting Forces Agreement and the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, US forces are now stationed across at least 9 official sites, including locations in Cagayan, Isabela, Palawan, and Zambales, areas that are close to the West Philippine Sea and Taiwan Strait. And as Ibon Foundation warns, these bases are just the beginning. More access points, such as the Subic Bay, are being quietly reopened, transforming the Philippines into what we can call one big US military base. We are told that this is about modernization, that this will strengthen our defense posture. But what is being modernized here is not our sovereignty, not our ability to care for our people, but the infrastructure of foreign war. The Balikatan 2025 exercises saw over 14,000 US troops joined by forces from Japan and Australia, rehearsing joint operations on our land, sea, air, cyber, and space domains. These are not symbolic drills. These are simulations for conflict with China. And the Philippines has been placed without the people's consent on the front line of a war that we did not ask for. At the same time, we are seeing how US military aid and strategy are shaping domestic counterinsurgency policy. The so-called National Roadmap to Unity, Peace, and Development advanced by the Marcos government reflects the US counterinsurgency doctrine, where development is militarized, civilian governance is subordinated to security goals. In this model, aid comes through armed troops. Community programs are linked to surrender campaigns, and political dissent is equated with insurgency. Social organizers, church workers, and health volunteers are surveilled, red tagged, or even worse. These are not abstract frameworks. They have real consequences in real communities. In Quezon Province, the local human rights network, Tanggol Quezon, documented the presence of US soldiers accompanying Philippine troops to counterinsurgency operations, specifically in clearing missions and patrols in rural barangays. These sightings confirm what many have long feared, that the US military is not simply training, it is operating side by side with the AFP in the suppression of our communities. And this is not unique to Quezon Province. Across the country, in Bicol, Samar, Mindoro, the Cordilleras, and beyond, militarization is intensifying. With it comes forced evacuations, harassments, vilification, and the disruption of everyday life. This is the real impact of US intervention today. It erodes Philippine sovereignty as our territory is used for foreign strategy. It intensifies militarization as security aid fuels repression. It undermines peace as land disputes, resistance, and dissent are treated as military threats. And it normalizes impunity, as seen in the case of Jennifer Laude, where justice was denied by diplomatic privilege. Yet, in the face of all of this, the Marcos Jr. government now campaigns for a seat at the United Nations Security Council, projecting itself as a force for global peace. But we asked, how can a government that allows foreign troops to operate with impunity speak of peace? How can it defend human rights when they themselves are the human rights violators? We are here to say we will not be silenced. Not by tanks, not by treaties, and not by the soft language of militarized development. We demand the immediate termination of EDCA and VFA and all other military agreements that allow foreign intervention. A full public investigation into US troop involvement in internal military operations, including those in Quezon and other rural provinces. Put a stop to the Marcos administration's bid for the UN Security Council. And we call for a genuine peace process rooted in land reform, justice, and people-centered development, not dictated by foreign war strategy. Colleagues, this is what Pagtatanim means to us. We are not just planting ideas, we are planting defiance. We are cultivating sovereignty. We are tending to memory, and we are preparing to harvest a peace that is not imposed from above, but grown from the ground. So let them bring their warships, let them draw their maps, let them draft their treaties behind closed doors. We will meet them in the open, in the fields, in our communities, in our organizing, in our voices. Because what grows here is not fear, but courage. What grows here is not silence, but struggle. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you so much to both of our panelists. Let's give them another round of applause. Both Drew and Charm have made it clear that when we talk about the struggle for peace in the Philippines, we need to view it as linked to the Filipino people's long-standing fight for their right to be free from foreign domination and have ownership over their land and resources. So I hope we can take what we have learned here today and continue building an unbreakable solidarity for the Filipino people's struggle for national and social liberation and genuine peace. Thank you so much.